is very exciting to see so many smiling faces here at the Stage and Rock Center. Great night to be up here. We're going to have some great stories, I'm sure. And I'm glad that you're taking the opportunity. We're celebrating our 200th anniversary. I'll just put a plug in for that. Please watch Facebook, like our page, share it with your friends, share it with people that lived in East Bridgewater that moved away, and people that are still here that keep telling me, I don't know how to hear about these things. We've got stuff on Facebook, we've got it on the town website. So participate, because that's great activities. Of course, this town was founded in 1823 on June the 14th. So we're leading up to that with a big celebration. There's posters all over the place that you can learn what's going on. So figure them out. I see a lot of familiar faces, which is good, but also new faces, so that's good too. So we are reaching for more volume. Don, you can't hear me back there? We use sign language. So we're reaching for participation from the town and surrounding towns. We appreciate anyone that comes out. The committee we're working on, we've been having a great time. About a year now we've been working on it. One of my cohorts is in the corner over there, Mr. Dave Sheedy from the Board of Selectmen, and also the co-chairman of the Bicentennial Commission. How you doing, Dave?
Always a pleasure.
Good to see you. And also in the audience we have members of our Bicentennial Committee, and I would like them to please stand up and be recognized, if you would. I know one's here. Occasion. So again, like I said, get out there and participate. And one thing I will make mention of, we have all these beautiful books here. We're going to add one more book by the end of this year. It's going to be a little memory of East Bridgewater. We are putting it together now. We want everybody who's ever lived here and wants to tell a story to say it. The problem is, it can't be a long story. We're looking for a paragraph. We're looking for 2 paragraphs at the most of some memorable moment, okay? So just something funny that happened, whether it's school or activities or just living in town. Beth Hayes, who's escaping back there, point her out. We are going to, she's working on it, she's coordinating the effort. And if you remember her from our town, which she edited for 25 years up until this year, so she's ripe for a new challenge. And we are going to do that book. So participate there too. All right, without further ado, we have a very special guest speaker tonight. I'm looking forward to this program. Just met Michael a little bit ago, but I think we share a lot of common interests, so I'm looking forward to the program. Michael Tougias.
Thank you. Happy birthday. I thought I'd begin by telling you a little bit about myself and my writing career. I grew up in Western Massachusetts. And I never intended to be a writer. I was a business major at St. Michael's College. And when I was about 30, I started writing books with a New England theme. So one of the early ones is called There's a Porcupine in My Outhouse. The subtitle is The Vermont Misadventures of a Mountain Man Wannabe. So this book won the Best Nature Book of the Year, and I thought, oh, I could quit my job. Well, not so fast. I learned that you need to have national sales, not just regional sales, to be able to make a living as a writer. So then I started to branch out and got into a lot of these sea rescue books. And then the lucky break came when they made The Finest Hours book into a Disney movie. So that is when things started to fall into place. But up on the table here, for example, I've got a lot of books at half price. Some are at $5 because my garage is so filled with books. I'm determined this is the year I'm going to get my car in the garage. And if you buy any book today, you get a free copy of The Hidden Charles or Porcupine in the Outhouse while they last. And lately, so I did a little switch in my career the last few years, was writing books for young adults. particularly the middle reader group, you know, age maybe 9 to 15. And I have a series with Macmillan where we're doing a lot of these true rescue and survival stories. But every now and then I like to do a fun one, and I did a book called Claws about a giant lobster. So it's a takeoff on the movie Jaws for kids, that this giant lobster terrorizes an island in Maine. And it is based on actual research because I go out with commercial fishermen on the ocean, and one of them showed me that just the claw part at the leg of something that came up in his trap, it was 20 inches of just the claw. So I said, how big could the lobster be? He said, well, it couldn't fit in the trap, so we only got the claw. And he estimated the lobster to be over 4 feet. Wow. So I said, well, maybe there's one 7 feet, and that resulted in claws. And then my latest book is kind of a culmination of my life's work about all these survivors. What I did was I took every interesting survival story I could find, and they couldn't be, just a 2-hour survival ordeal. They had to be at least 1 day or more. So many of these are week-long events. And then I extrapolated the lessons learned. How did they get through these events when I would have given up? And so when I interviewed these people, I would ask those questions, and pretty soon a pattern started to form between different people I interviewed. So I grouped their techniques that they used to keep going by chapter. So for example, the first chapter is called The Power of Little Steps. So many of the survivors who I met said, the reason I didn't give up is I didn't think of the big picture because it was so overwhelming, I knew I'd never make it. So I broke things down into an hour. And they go, what do you mean? And like Ernie Hazard, who was adrift in the Atlantic Ocean in November, in and out of a life raft, tumbling in the waves, he just said to himself, get through the next hour, do the best you can, then you'll decide, do you want to keep fighting? And so pretty soon, he strung hour after hour, and he survived 3 days in the North Atlantic, in and out of a life raft. His stories in Fatal Forecast, but also in Extreme Survival. And he was one of the toughest survivors. So when I learned his story, I said, Ernie, that's just like Brad Kavanaugh told me, another Massachusetts survivor, where the people in his life raft, 2 of them just said, oh, I'm going to sip a little seawater because we're so dehydrated. He's like, don't. And they sipped a little, then a little more, and you know what that does? It dehydrates your brain. And all of a sudden one of them goes, I'm going to get some beer and cigarettes. And Brad goes, no, there's sharks. And he steps out of the life raft and boom. So I said to Brad, how did you do it? And his answer was similar to Ernie Hazard's. So they're in the same chapter. So that's the theme of extreme survival. So I did 2 books on King Philip's War. The first one is this historical novel. It's told primarily through the eyes of a Native American who's fictional, but all the events in the book are true, and they're in the right chronological order. But to give it balance, there's another main character named John Homer, who's based on a real person, but again, it's historical fiction, so I can create dialogue. And you see the events unfold from his perspective. And then within it is a love story between 2 Native Americans swept up in this war. And then that led to a really lucky, fortuitous meeting with Eric Schultz. And I thought maybe I had a slide of his book, but that's the history one over there, just titled King Philip's War. He had been working on that, and he wrote me a nice letter, back when people wrote letters, and said, oh, I read your novel, loved it. And I said, let's get together for coffee. I said, I'm working on a history, and you said in your letter you are too. And he was much further along, and I said, well, why don't we work together? And I said, and because you're much further along, I'll act as the agent, I'll do all the maps, I'll get us a good publisher, and it was a great collaboration. So he was the lead, and then I tagged along and filled in the gaps. And I said, why not put in some diaries of real people that lived during the war at the end of the war? And I said, they're in the public domain, anybody can print them up. So we put in Mary Rowlandson, she was taken captive. We put in Benjamin Church, he was this swashbuckling Indian fighter, and Captain Wheeler, who was at the Brookfield ambush. So you get to, at the very back of the book, it's kind of like this bonus section where you get to read it from the people who are actually there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the war with the slides, and then at the end we'll open up the Q&A. And is there someone in the audience who's like a real expert on Bridgewater? Because I know the Bridgewater area was attacked, and my research showed it was attacked in May of 1676. Does that sound, is there an expert in that?
I'm not an expert, but that's right. I was looking at history today, so.
And I was surprised at that because by May of 1676, things were not going well for the natives, and I was surprised they could muster a major attack here. Apparently, no citizens of Bridgewater died in the attack, but many homes and farms were burned. But we'll get to that. I start off with a little bit of background about the Native American way of life. So, here we go. This shows where the tribes were located before the Europeans came. And it's interesting, the Massachusetts tribe was just wiped out by disease from early explorers and fishermen. And so was the tribe where modern day Plymouth is. And that's one of the reasons the Pilgrims picked Plymouth, because fields had been cleared. They said, oh, it's a sign from God, but it was because the natives had cleared the field, but they had all been killed by disease. So when we talk about King Philip, he had two names. Philip was his English given name, he was a Native American, and his native name was Medicon. So two names. And he was a Wampanoag. They were not nomadic. They lived in weetus, we call them wigwams. They were an agricultural-based people. So you see the grinding stone in the front. You know, they take the corn, dry it, pound it into cornmeal. They did have female leaders, by the way, too. So in many respects, they were more advanced than the Europeans. They had some female sachems. Historians and archaeologists say that the highest concentration of Native Americans was right here in coastal Massachusetts and coastal Rhode Island. And so we found this big axe head in Plymouth in a sand pit. It's the only Indian artifact I've ever found. I've searched and searched. Natives would use those to cut down the big white pines and fashion them into dugout canoes. So when you hear dugout canoes, you know you're talking about southern New England. Birch bark canoes were in northern New England because you have the big white birch trees. One of the first inventions by Native Americans was the attle-attle, or the throwing stick. So the spear rests on the top, and when he brings his arm forward, the spear goes flying off. It's an amazing invention. That's my old friend Stanley. He made me a bunch of those, and you could stand at one goalpost at a football field and almost hit the other goalpost. It's that accurate. It's a friend of mine, Wes, he's an Abenaki Indian, but I put this slide early to jog my memory to remind you that when we get into the war part of this, the natives did have muskets, so it wasn't like they were just fighting with bow and arrows and the colonists had all the muskets. The natives had muskets as well. They've been trading for them for many years. Natives wouldn't think of killing a deer without utilizing every aspect of the animal's body. For example, even the deer antlers, you could take a piece of quartz and using the antler chipping away, shape it into a projectile point. One of the books I used when I was writing Until I Have No Country, the novel, historical novel, so I wanted to find as much, eyewitness source as I could from that period. And one of the books I found was called New England Prospect, written by William Wood in 1630. And he wrote it kind of like a travelogue to get more people from England to come to America. And he says, there's this great beast in the New World, we call it the moose, based on the native name. But then he says, and we plan to ride it, and it will plow all our fields. But when you look at it, it looks like a horse, so I can see why he said that. By the way, right after I took this slide, the moose whipped around, turned its head, went and charged. I was so lucky. I was in a canoe, and I just backed out as fast as I could. I learned my lesson. Natives would go inside muskrat lodges, take the top off, reach inside, not to get the muskrat, but to get the roots and the tubers stored in there, and then they would ground them down and use them for food. But they were smart. They didn't take them all, and then they'd repatch the top because they'd want the muskrat to survive the winter. So they call that survival. We call it conservation, but same idea. And then this is the long ditch on the Charles River. It connects one part of the Charles to another in Denham. And when the settlers came, they started to alter the landscape to suit their needs. So they're digging ditches through marshes to drain out low-lying areas, to let their cattle go in. And the cattle was a prized possession for the English. And they caused a lot of friction between the natives and the English, because they'd get loose, they'd eat Indian corn. But anyways, there it is, dug in 1650 and still straight as an arrow today, dug by hand. And then, of course, they built mill sites. This is one of the more beautiful ones that you might take a Sunday drive here, the Gilbert Stewart Mill down in Whitford, Rhode Island. So when Eric and I were doing the book, we said, well, people are going to use this book and want to go to the battle sites, go to the places. So we kept turning down different publishers until we found one that would put in all 50 maps. Because people want to go to the Gilbert Stewart Mill and see what an old mill looks like and how it works. Basically, the way it works is they dammed up a stream, backed up the water, create the mill pond, then a little sluiceway opened up a gate, the water would rush through the sluiceway, hit the wheel, and turn it for power. Look what we've done to Cape Cod. But I remember years ago when I went out to P-Town and saw the Pilgrim Monument, I'm like, why is that out here? The Pilgrims went to Plymouth. But they went to Cape Cod first, and they were going to settle there, but they made the mistake of digging up some Indian corn that was buried in a woven basket. And whether they knew it or not, they were digging up a gravesite. So the natives attacked them, and that's why they got back on the Mayflower and went on to Perth. Town commons, just about every town had a town common, and that means that it's common land. Anybody could use it for night pasture. So the really good ones, like this picture is in Grafton, still have the old fences around it, granite posts. And you would bring in your sheep and cattle at night, because we had wolves and mountain lion here in New England. And today we've got the coyotes, but they've interbred with wolves, so they're much bigger than the coyotes out west. And then whether or not we have a mountain lion or two in New England is up for debate. I happen to be a believer. I've never seen them. I've never seen their tracks. But I've interviewed some people who really know what they're talking about, and they swear they've seen mountain Because my daughter, she's about 5 years old now, she's 35, working in London as a vice president of a financial firm, but I would drag her all over to all these sites. And when I showed her this picture, she said, I remember that day, I'm drinking chocolate milk. The natives had one thing besides land that the settlers wanted, and that was the beaver pelts. It was all the rage back in London. You know, you have a beaver-lined collar on your coat or a hat because it would keep you so warm. So there was an active trade going on. And what the natives wanted from the colonists were steel implements because they didn't have that. So they would bring their beaver pelts to different trading posts. This is one on the Tuxet Canal, or excuse me, the Tuxet trading post on the Cape Cod Canal. And it's on the Cape side of the canal down in Bourne. So if you're walking that side of the canal, you could just veer a few feet off it and see this old trading post. Long before the canal was built, there were these two rivers that came close together. So, you know, with a short portage, you could go from one river to the other. And out in front, they had the town stocks. I'll tell you, the Puritans especially, more so than Plymouth Colony, which Bridgewater was part of, the Puritans who settled Boston westward, very intolerant. For example, if you were a Quaker and you spoke up too much about your religion, they'd put you in the stocks. And if you didn't zip it up, then they'd take a hot iron spike and bore it right through the middle of your tongue so you could never talk again. And so that's why so many Quakers left Mass Bay Colony and went down to Rhode Island, where Roger Williams had a more open society. So for example, here's a Quaker meeting house close to the Rhode Island border. This is down in Dartmouth. But you won't see these meeting houses anywhere west of Boston because all the Quakers got out of it. So it's, you know, history's so interesting. You know, they say the Pilgrims and the Puritans came here for their religious freedom. It was for their own religious freedom and nobody else's. You know, when you look back on it and try to be objective. I took this shot, I'm standing like near the top of the South Natick Dam and then the water rushes by. This was the site of a big praying Indian community where the Reverend John Eliot had converted natives to Christianity. They're living like the white man. But then when King Philip's War breaks out, so many of them are rounded up and put out on Deer Island because they're suspects. And the problem is that the colonists didn't give them enough food or shelter to survive the winter. So many of these Christian Indians died on Deer Island, who had their homes right here in South Natick and Dover, Sherborne. So what did Metacom look like? Well, it didn't look like this. When the original version of King Philip's War came out, this was on the cover. And I said to the publisher, that's not what he looked like. And they said, do you have something better? Nobody bothered to do a painting or a sketch of him while he was alive. So you just have these revisionist pieces, like he didn't wear a little gold crown on his head. The English named him king. He wasn't a king, he was a sachem. And as a sachem, you can't act like a king. You can't say, okay, we're going to war today. You'd have to convince the people. So he must have been very influential that way. But he couldn't order people around. And then this was supposed to be him, but I thought that looked more like a Roman gladiator. Yeah. But then this, I said, no, that's more like it. And I met the sculptor, Phil Cote, and I said, boy, how amazing how you got that look in his eyes in a piece of bronze. And I said, what were you trying to capture? And he said, the closing days of the war. And I knew what he meant because Metacom had a wife and a son who I believe was 10 years old, and they were captured by the English. And it was the Reverend Keith from the Bridgewaters here who spoke up on the son's behalf. So all the other ministers wanted to execute the son. He was only 10 years old. But Keith was the one who said, no, that's wrong. And he was not executed, but it was a fate almost as bad, sold into slavery, ended up in the Caribbean working the sugarcane fields until they dropped dead. So if you were a woman or a child, you were shipped right out of the country if you were caught by the English. The men were executed. So now we're going to get into the opening days of the war. So it started in June of 1675 when some natives attacked a farm in Swansea, Massachusetts. And it went back to that whole issue with the cattle getting loose. They had had enough with the cattle eating the corn, so they killed some cattle. There was a farmer and a young man who witnessed what the natives were doing. The young man picked up the musket, killed a native. Natives always believed if the English drew first blood, the natives would win the war because there were kind of tensions were mounting, which I'll talk about. But that's how the war started, that one incident in Swansea, Massachusetts. But there was a buildup to it. In Until I Have No Country, the character is really torn, the Native American, what to do. He knows if we go to war, it's all or nothing. You know, if we lose, they're just going to kill us all, take everything. But if we do nothing, slowly you can see your land is going in the way life is going. So they take that gamble. A couple incidents before the war. Here's where the death of John Sassamon occurred down at Assawampsett. His body was found in the springtime when the ice melted. And the English, they used him as an interpreter. So they figured, oh, it was Metacom's people that killed him, thinking he might have been a spy. And we'll never know if that's true or not. You know, sadly, we don't have a native recollection of the war except their oral history, but not the written language. But 3 close advisors to Metacom were rounded up, brought to Plymouth, put through a trial. And the funny thing was, I read there were a couple natives on the jury, and I'm like, well, that's good. Then I realized, but they couldn't vote, so what good is that? And they found them guilty and hung all 3. So I'm sure that's probably when Metacom's mind switched on, we gotta go to war. So his home base was in Mount Hope, Rhode Island. The natives, that Mount Hope is a derivative of the native word Montauk, which means the high place. So it's that little hill there. And sadly, I don't think you can walk down there anymore. It's on Brown University land, because down at this little rise is King Philip's seat, where legend has it he would sit like I am in that picture and address the tribe to try to get them to follow what he wants to do. But, you know, there was a couple happy incidents from this whole sad war in terms of, you know, as you're doing all the research, a lot of it is pretty bloody. But when Until I Have No Country came out, I was contacted by Native Americans. And a lot of people go, are you part Native American? I go, I don't have a drop of blood. And if I could choose, I'd be a Pequot because they don't fox boots. But I got a phone call from a leader of the Native Americans, this Pokanoket band. And he said, we've all read Until I Have No Country, and we think it's balanced, shown from both perspectives. Would you like to come to our ceremony? And I said, absolutely. Can I take pictures? Is that okay? And they said, sure. So they held it right at King Philip's seat there. And it was really interesting how they got the kids involved. They had one child shoot an arrow off into the woods, and then all the other kids would run and try and find it. And whoever was the kid who found it, he became the honorary leader for the next celebration. But because he found the arrow, he was given extra homework about the tribe. So that's how they hope to keep the culture going. And I was like, wow, what a great idea. Because every kid wants to find the arrow, and then you go, oh, I got homework. So after the natives attacked Swansea, and I don't think Metacom ordered that attack. I think he was still in the planning stages of trying to get the Narragansetts to join with him against the English. But he's smart enough not to be trapped on Mount Hope because it's a peninsula. And he knows, the Puritan Bay will come and arrest him, so will Plymouth. So he takes his people across Mount Hope Bay, across the Taunton River, and hides in the Pocasset Swamp because he doesn't want to be trapped on the peninsula. And down in Tiverton, Rhode Island, there's this field, and it's called the Pease Field. And that was the first ambush of the war. Benjamin Church, who again, his diary's in the back of the book, he gets some volunteers to go in and get Metacom in that swamp. Not a lot of people want to go into a swamp because the natives know it better than the English, but he does get some followers. And he writes in his account that we walked right into an ambush here in the peas field. He said peas were growing and the natives were hiding behind those bigger trees in the back, and they sprang the ambush. So he said our only option was to run down to the water's edge, hide behind the rocks, and fight a defensive battle. And what saved them was just luck. A ship saw the incident, small ship, had a canoe on board, took the canoe off, they started ferrying Church and his men to safety. And Church took one musket ball right through his hat and another through the arm of his coat, but lived. And I always thought, boy, that the natives should have killed him because he becomes very effective. He learns from this mistake. And I wondered why they didn't get him, because they could have overran him. And the only conclusion I came to is this was the first skirmish of the war, so it wasn't the all or nothing mentality yet. So they let Church off the hook, but they should have killed him while they had him in this spot during the opening days. And one of the joys of researching King Philip's War is you can go to these sites. A lot of them are on public land. And then behind the church at Little Compton is where Benjamin Church is buried in one of these raised granite tombs. So again, we put the maps and we show how to get to these spots. And while Metacom is hiding in the swamp, and he's got braves, he's got women and children with him, he is sneaking out at night and attacking nearby towns. So for example, in this slide, Dartmouth was attacked, and this was the garrison foundation that's in the spot where the actual garrison was. Now this is an opinion, not a fact. In my opinion, the natives made a mistake in laying siege to these garrison houses. Because a garrison is a safe house, so say Bridgewater is being attacked and you're a colonist, you run to the safe house when you hear the cannon go off or a musket shot, and inside would be extra food, water, ammunition, and sometimes they'd even put bricks in the lower part of the wall so musket balls couldn't come through. And I think in a war of attrition, which is what King Philip's War was really all about, the natives were wasting too many warriors trying to take these garrison houses. This one, they were successful in killing a number of settlers there. But that wasn't always the case. Then the settlers make a huge mistake. They've got Metacom trapped in the swamp, and they let him get away right under their nose. The red arrows show his movements in the opening weeks of the war. Leaves Mount Hope, crosses Mount Hope Bay, hides in the swamp, but then curls up this way, crosses the Taunton River, and now he wants to get to Central Mass because he's heard that the Nipmucks, through no coordination of his own, they had their own leader. Probably the most powerful one was Muddlewa, He's heard that the Nipmucks have risen up on their own and they're attacking the English also. So he's got an ally. He's going to join them. So likely came up the Blackstone River. The rivers were highways, paths along the side. And in Uxbridge, there is a beautiful, it's called King Philip's Overlook. So you look down on the Blackstone River. And in my travels, there's so many King Philip rocks, King Philip caves. He could have been at all these places. It's like George Washington slept here. But probably what happened was if a colonist saw a native during the war at a certain place, they named it after the one native name they knew, which was King Philip of Medical. So he and his people are making their way up towards Brookfield. This is beautiful country, by the way. Use the maps to go out here. So the Brookfields, Hardwick, Petersham, New Braintree, there's these gorgeous little towns. I was there on Saturday fishing on this river, and it's still got farmland around, crystal clear rivers and streams, and then the Nipmucks had a big encampment right where I'm taking this picture. And when Metacom comes, the Nipmucks are celebrating because they've burned the town of Brookfield down. In the way they did the Brookfield attack, there were some soldiers in the garrison. And by the way, when I say soldiers, they're just colonists who are taking up arms, so militia. There were no English soldiers involved. And I almost think that was intentional by the crown, you know, because the war went on for 14 months and the English never sent any troops over to help. So I think they were like, let the colonists deal with it. But what happened was the soldiers had told some of the local Nipmucks, be at this meeting location site. We're going to make you sign a peace treaty before this war gets out of hand. It's already out of hand, but they show up, the English do, on horseback with armor, muskets. Natives are not at the meeting location. A couple of the soldiers smell trouble and they're like, let's get out of here. But Captain Wheeler gets talked into pushing on towards the big Winnemesset camp to the north. And that was a mistake. There's no way the Indians are going to let them come in with armor and muskets and everything else. So they get him in an ambush, and Wheeler's shot right off his horse, but his son drags him, gets him on his own horse, and flees back to the garrison. And then the natives come down, they burn every house in Brookfield, but when they try to light the garrison on fire by putting this wagon, a flaming wagon into it, it starts to rain, and he puts the fires out. So that's the only reason we have Wheeler's account of what happened. He was lying inside, wounded, and as he recovered, he wrote down exactly what happened and how it rained and how really luck saved him. Although back then they never called it luck, everything was attributed to God. God is on our side. God is punishing us with these Indian devils because we've lost our way. That kind of thing is going on throughout these eyewitness accounts. But there were fatalities there. Major Wilson was killed going out to the well trying to get water before it rained. And then, this has nothing to do with King Philip's War, but right near that well site in the woods, maybe 10 feet off the road, was the original Benjamin Franklin milestone. And it says 67 miles to Boston, 36 miles to Springfield. So Franklin was hired, and then he had a crew, so he didn't do the manual labor, but to lay out these mile markers along the Old Bay Path. Because that's how you got charged for mail, how many miles you traveled. And travelers wanted to know how far they were. But this is a good one of the original ones just by the side of the road. And then if you do go out, again, nothing to do with King Philip's War, this is called the Rock House Reservation, open to the public. A lot of Indian artifacts were found under this overhang, and you could see why, during a snowy period, you could stay dry underneath. Light a fire there, reflecting off the wall, keep you warm. That is a trustees of the reservation land. They have some great properties around the state. So we're getting into the fall, and the Nipmunks and the Wampanoags, some of them leave Brookfield and set up a big base camp at the Great Falls. We call it Turner's Falls, they call it the Great Falls. And from there, they're attacking Northfield, Deerfield, Northampton, and even culminating in an attack burning about half of the homes in Springfield, Mass. The Mohawks stay out of it. Had they joined, I think the outcome of the war would have been different, but they had always been arch enemies with these New England tribes. So they wanted nothing to do with helping them. And this is when Bloody Brook occurred, another disaster for the colonists. So in the early days of the war, early months even, the Indians were winning. And so if you were living through that time period and you were a colonist, you'd be thinking, God, I may have to get back on a ship and go to London. They're going to take Boston eventually. So what happens with Bloody Brook, it used to be called Muddy Brook in this ambush. There were survivors in Deerfield holed up in the garrison, and people from the southern towns went up to rescue them, but they also wanted to get the grain that had been stored there in the fall. So they led a wagon train heading north, maybe expected an ambush, but nothing happened. Got the survivors, got the grain, heading back south, let their guard down. Some of the eyewitnesses said it was a hot fall day. Some of the soldiers had put their muskets in the wagon, thinking we're home free. Others were picking grapes because they were thirsty. And the natives must have had this well planned, because here's an old sketch, might have been a wood carving actually, this one. As they approach the brook, the natives are on either side, and they lay the ambush. And this is pretty typical. Get whoever it is you're going to ambush down in a ravine or a valley, you be up high and then open fire. It's an absolute disaster for the English. They lose 76 people in this one attack. And back then, that's a huge amount. So if you go out, they're buried on the town common of South Deerfield. So this monument is to those 76 people are buried right on the town common. And then you could take the road or the path up to the top of Mount Sugarloaf, and you get these beautiful views. I did a book called River Days, where I started at the Canadian border and with a canoe and sometimes a kayak went all 400 miles down to the ocean. It's a beautiful river, and this stretch here was really nice. That's the town of Sunderland in South Deerfield, looking down to Mount Sugarloaf. And when I was researching Until I Have No Country, I'd look down and go, boy, not much has changed. You know, the isolated farm down by the river. And then when I go into schools, I show them these slides, but I have this photo, and I say, this is no man's land out in the Berkshires, Mount Greylock, and this rock slide happened, and it's Chief Greylock. You know, in the profile, it's looking this way, and you see the mouth curved down, the nose, and I tell him that's Chief Greylock to come back to warn us not to develop the mountain. And then that gets their attention. A lot of kids tell me what they have to see. They say, no, it's not the chief, it's the head of a polar bear coming out of the water, or it's a shark. But then I show them this slide, and I say, look at that totem pole of heads running vertically, but it's actually a rock reflecting off the water, forming the heads in the middle. And if you look dead center, there's an alien. the wide head. This is all to keep the kids' attention. So we're into the winter, and these two tribes are doing quite well in central Mass. They control a big hunk. I grew up in Long Meadow, Mass. Our town was attacked. Many settlers were killed. They didn't take it over, but they did a lot of damage. And then the colonies do something that, back when I was first researching this, struck me as odd. They attack a neutral tribe, the Narragansetts. I'm like, why in the world would they do that if they're losing the war to two tribes already? But their thinking was, the Narragansetts are probably going to join with Metacom, and they're a really powerful tribe, so we have to do something drastic, and that's hit them in a surprise attack, like the Japanese hitting Pearl Harbor. So the colonies unite, and they find where this winter encampment is of the Narragansetts. A lot of snow back then. The winters were nothing like today. So much snow, it's hard to even describe in the cold. But that swamp is all frozen over, so they're able to get in there. And there is a sign down there. It's very hard to find. I remember when I interviewed Ella Secatown, she was the Narragansett historian, and I said, so tell me about the Great Swamp Fight. And she kind of pauses and looks me in the eye, and she goes, you mean Great Swamp Massacre, because it was women and children, and we were neutral. So I could see her point. But from the colonist point of view, they lost a lot of soldiers, so it was a fight. But I could see why she was so sensitive, correcting me and saying that sign should have never said fight. And this is a scene in Until I Have No Country, based on an eyewitness account. The only way into this Indian fort, this encampment, in the beginning was over this log. They had dug a ditch around the perimeter, and those first soldiers were just being picked off it. And so in Until I Have No Country, I show what happens when it's John Homer's turn to go over the wall. And a lot of this is based on an eyewitness account by Benjamin Church and an old book called Foot Soldiers of King Philip's War. So there is a monument to where that happened. So the big one in the middle is the Narragansett Nation, and then the smaller stones are the attacking colonies. So Church, once they overrun the camp, Church says, hey, there's food in the wigwams, corn. Let's us, the colonists, use their camp as our base camp to fight the remaining Narragansetts. But he's overruled by Captain Winslow, and Winslow says, torch the village, and then we're heading back to the garrison. But they've got to go back through all these big snow drifts. Some of the men are wounded, and many die on the way, and they're buried in the I guess this is the backyard of Smith's Castle, or the Smith Garrison in Woodford. Church was right. They should have just held on to that as their own base camp. The poor Narragansetts, they're sucked into the war now, and they're going to fight because they've been attacked. But it's a disaster for them. They go from owning most of modern-day Rhode Island in a good relationship with Roger Williams to, at the end of the war, just down to a few acres confined to a reservation. So just in the course of just 14 months, eons and eons of living gone. So we're in the winter, February, and this is where Mary Rowlandson is taken captive in Lancaster. And then the dotted line show her trail of captivity. And I thought, why were they moving around so much? And it's clear when you read her diary, she said, we were starving, not just me, but the natives as well. We had to keep moving to look for food. And one thing they subsisted on back then is ground nuts. It's something we know very little about today, but I was looking it up. It's a vine-like plant that has a a tuber at the end of it, kind of like a little potato. They did get inside the garrison house at Lancaster, and that's when they took her captive. They took her children captive too. Some survived, but her youngest daughter, Sarah, died 2 days into captivity from a bullet wound during the attack. Finding her gravesite in the middle of the woods, that was tricky. It's in New Braintree. We show roughly how to get there, but that was part of the fun of the book was the excitement of not being able to find something, but the persistence of keep going back, and I realized the reason I couldn't find the little headstone in the woods is it was right next to a stone wall, so from a distance, it just looked like part of the stone wall. So Mary was eventually released. I think it was something like 10 or 11 weeks of captivity she survived. In fact, she was so smart and such a tough survivor, I put her in extreme survival and quoted from her diary about how she got through it. What she did, at times she knew when to push the Indians, and at times she knew when to back off. For example, she even had a conversation with Medicom, and she said, I'm going to knit your son a woolen cap. I don't know where she got the yarn or whatever she used, but she did knit him a cap, and that got her a little extra food. And it was those moves that allowed her to survive when others did not. So she never gave up. She was always thinking ahead, how do I get through this? I just put this in to mention the Abenakis were attacking coastal Maine with no coordination from Medicom. They believe they have Medicom's War Club at the Fruitlands Museum. Whether it is or not, we don't know, but somebody actually stole it. It was missing for 20 years, and then it turned up in a tag sale. You could have bought it for $75. It's all one big maple piece. It's not a rock at the end, inlaid with triangular shells of wampum. So it's clearly a chief's war club, but was it his or not? We don't know. We're still in the winter months. The natives have a big encampment at Mount Wachusett, but we've never located the exact spot. But this is when they make the raid on Medfield. It's a big raid, and there's an interesting story behind it. Sometimes it's good just to drill down to one individual. This farmer wakes up early, and he goes out to his barn. He's got his pitchfork. He's feeding his cattle. And under the hay, he sees the outline of a leg, and he looks closer. He sees a moccasin. He knows it's a native hiding in his barn. Picks up the pitchfork to stab and kill the native, and then he stops, and he thinks, wait a minute, what if there's more than one? They're going to jump me. So he's really cool. He acts like he doesn't see anything, puts the pitchfork down, walks out, then runs to his house, wakes up his family, and we believe this is where his house was, and they did survive. The house was burned, and this was rebuilt 2 years later. So this gives you an idea of what the homes looked like in 1676. This is called the Peak House in Medford. So now we move into the spring, and now we're kind of near the apex of the native victories. Wadsworth and his men walk into an ambush in Sudbury. The natives just decimate them. And Benjamin Church is pleading with the authorities, take friendly Indians by your side, because they can spot an ambush a mile away. You keep walking into them. Finally, they begin to listen after this terrible ambush. And all these towns are attacked that spring. Many more, including the Bridgewaters. But this is the high point. From here, it's almost like things fall off a cliff for the natives. And I think a lot has to do with the lack of food. their villages have been burned by English. They weren't able to grow their crops that first summer of the war, so they didn't have dry food to get them all the way through the winter. Now it's spring, and there's no new crops yet, so they're starving, and their numbers are decimated. So there's a couple incidents that really are the turning point. One is the head of the Narragansetts is caught, and the authorities are listening to Benjamin Church. You can see the Connecticut English are fighting with friendly Indians, Niantics and Mohegans. They capture Canonchet and behead them, and so that's the end of the Narragansett leadership. Muttlump is captured as well. Metacom's still alive. And then the big raid on Turner's Falls. Captain Turner gets intel from an escaped boy, an English boy who escaped the Indians, and he says, I know exactly where the encampment is, and they don't have many guards posted, so Turner gets volunteers to attack. And they go up the Connecticut River from Northampton, Hadley, Springfield. There's this big encampment. So this is at the falls. And the reason they'd be at the falls is there's shad, and herring, salmon are coming up the river. That's a good place to catch them. They hit the falls and school up there. And you've got heavy snow melt. It's early spring. And some of the natives, when they're attacked, they try to swim across the river, but the current's so strong, sweeps them right over the falls. So this shows Turner was pretty smart. Instead of attacking from the south, which is probably where the natives might have had a guard or two posted, he curls around to the north, where they would least expect the attack to come from, and then pushes down into the village from there. But after he wipes out the village, and it's just a devastating blow to the natives, because this was their safe haven to kind of go and rest and resupply. But after he destroys the village, he's got to get back to safety. And he, on his retreat route, some natives who survive catch up with him and kill Captain Turner. So he does not survive that attack. And it was really interesting writing the novel. I had reoccurring dreams about this because I had read so much about it. So I said, finally, I'm going to put part of the dream in the book because it's so realistic. So that part of the book, if you read it, where this colonist during the retreat, all of a sudden they're attacked by natives, he gets cut off from the rest of his men, and he's got to go it alone. That was this reoccurring dream I had. So what does Metacom do? We don't think he was at the Great Falls attack. We think he was at the base camp out of Massachusetts. He decides to go back to his homeland, and this is speculation, but probably to go down fighting in the area he knows best, which is Mount Hope or Bristol, Rhode Island. Maybe, maybe as a last stand. So we're into August of 1676. And believe it or not, it's one of his own people that kills him. A traitor who's joined up with Benjamin Church, tells Church where Metacom is by this spring, and a colonist goes to fire his musket, be the hero. The musket misfires, but the native's musket worked, and he's the one who put two musket balls through the back of Metacom. And so there is no more effective leadership. And so there is a marker hidden in the woods there of where he was killed in the miry swamp, it says. There's a strange tree growing there, an ash tree and a birch tree coming out of the same trunk. And then the one last little incident was Anawan, the right-hand man of Metacom. Those Pokanoket natives said, in your book, you based Tamaset off Anawan. And at that time, I was like, who's Anawan? They're like, oh, we thought you used him as your character. And then as I studied up on Anawan, I did see the similarities. So they said that was Anawan's spirit guiding you. You never know. The big difference is Anawan was older. He was like an elderly advisor to Metacom, and in my book, his advisor is younger. But Anawan is captured by Benjamin Church at Anawan Rock in Rehoboth. Church crawls up to the top of that rock, peers over the edge, sees Anawan and maybe 5, 6, 7 other warriors camping on the other side. And in this sketch, they move around and they've got the Indians trapped. They come around either side of that big rock. And the reason the Indians didn't fight back was they made the mistake of putting their muskets under a woven mat to keep them dry because it was drizzling that night. And so when the soldiers moved in, they didn't have their weapons. And Anawan is hung in Plymouth, and that's the end of the leadership and basically the end of the war in southern New England. So I'm going to end on a high note. When I went to school and my town was attacked, in our history classes they taught us about, Thanksgiving and how well that went. Then the next thing you know, we were in the Revolution. They skipped all these years in between about the French and Indian Wars, about King Philip's War, about the Pequot War. So the good news is the curriculum has been changed, and they touch on it. They don't go into it deeply, but at least they don't sweep it under the rug now, and they touch on King Philip's War in the 3rd grade, I believe, in the beginning, in the 6th grade. So it slowly but surely, it's got a wider knowledge because, again, when I grew up, I saw King Philip signs everywhere in Springfield and Long Meadow, but I thought it was a king of England because they didn't teach English in school. Now they are, so that's the good news. Thank you very much. Questions or comments before we break? I'll do the book signing. Yes?
Yeah, I heard this King Philip's War was one of the bloodiest that was ever fought. Didn't sound that bloody from your
listen to this statistic. On a per capita basis, when you take the population being smaller into account, it was the bloodiest war ever fought by any Americans. Higher than even the Civil War. Makes World War II look like a little bump compared to this one. So every family was affected on both sides. Yeah, it was absolutely brutal. Yes?
Benjamin Church. The town of Rochester is awfully proud of the Benjamin Church. Is that the Benjamin Church?
It must be. Yeah, he lived in Little Compton for a while, but I know you also have lived near that Rochester area. What made him so effective is he had a lot of natives who were friends. And so he learned from them not to walk in ambushes and things like that. Yes?
Do you know if any of the area that's now East Bridgewater was affected during the war?
Yeah, this was raided, and again, I'm so surprised that it happened in May, because that's when the natives were really in trouble, but they somehow mustered up the strength to attack Bridgewater.
Robert Latham, who stones out here, his home was also attacked. There was multiple ones in the Middleborough area that were burned. And luckily, he had moved out already. He was what I call South Bridgewater at the time, Middleborough, so he wasn't home.
Yeah, so it must have probably been a large contingent of Narragansetts, I would think.
Most of the original settlers in East Bridgewater lost their
Lost
homes
their, wow.
between April and anything else.
And is your research the same as mine, that no settlers were killed during the
No
attack?
settlers were killed.
That's amazing. So they must have been tipped off in some way, shape, or form.
I think so. Well, there was,
Maybe Reverend Keith was tipped off.
I always wondered where the garrison, I know Reverend Keith's home was a garrison. But I don't know if it's a garrison for everybody. Because I'm not sure.
Yeah, certainly within that area.
Is it garrison?
It was one.
There's a garrison on this property.
Wow.
Which would make sense, because a lot of the holy stores where I live.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It almost gives you goosebumps knowing like we're standing on an area that something probably happened. You know, so, yeah, sometimes you feel the spirit when you go into it. Well, I hope you take a look at the books. Anybody into audio books, I've got those marked down to 70% off. Because audio people are doing now through their phones. Yeah, one last question.
I'm Howard Wilbur. I grew up just up the street at 439 Plymouth.
Yeah.
And in the 40s, my father would go out to all the plowed fields around and look for the arrowheads.
Oh, it must have been
And
a
so
million
over the
back
years,
then.
he had a collection of like a dozen of them
Wow.
that he found all around the plowed fields.
Yeah, they say go through the plowed field right after it's been plowed and it rains. I haven't found them, but I keep looking. Thank you, everyone.